Ecology. What is ecology? Ecology is the study of the interactions that take place between organisms and their environment. It explains how living organisms affect each other and the world we live in. So if we're looking at interactions between organisms, we can look at things like predator-prey, so a fox eating a rabbit, or we can look at parasitism, so the worms that live in the rabbit's belly, or we can look at competition, so the rabbits and the deer are both eating grass. So there are all kinds of different interactions between organisms. Some are beneficial to both. So for example, a honeybee and a flower, they both benefit in that the bee is getting nectar and the flower is getting pollinated. And then we're looking at these interactions between the organisms and their environment. Is it warm enough and is there enough rain to have any grass grow at all so that the rabbits and the deer have something to eat? The first thing that we're going to look at is energy flow in an ecosystem. We'll look later at nutrient cycling. So the carbon that's in you is the same carbon that may have been in a dinosaur once upon a time. The energy flow is different though. That came from the sun in almost all cases. And it's flowing through an ecosystem, and as it flows through, it's used, and it never disappears. Energy can't be destroyed, but it is dissipated, which means it's spread out so much that it's never going to be used again. So the energy that you have is from the stuff that you ate, and that stuff got its energy either directly from the sun, or if it's a plant that you ate, or it got it from eating something else. So first we want to define ecosystems. An ecosystem is a combination of the biotic factors. Biotic means living. So if you look at the word biotic, it starts with bio. Bio is life. So biology is the study of life. Biotic factors are living things. If you put an A in, well, let's do some biotic factors. I've got a couple here. Here's a plant. Um, Pretty flowers. And here's a really mean looking fish. I think this one was on Nemo. Scary. Okay, abiotic means non-living. So biotic means living. If you put an A in front of it, it means the opposite. So another example of this is if you have sexual and asexual species. So sexual means that you've got two parents and that the kids are all different from each other and the kids are different from their parents. Asexual means that there's just one parent and all the offspring look the same and the same as each other and the same as the parent. Same thing with theist and atheist. A theist believes in God, an atheist does not. Political, apolitical. Political is someone who's really interested in what's going on politically, and apolitical is someone who just doesn't care, doesn't watch the news, doesn't really want to know what's going on. So when you put an A in front of a word, it means not. Here's an example of an abiotic factor, lightning. And here's another example, water. Is there any water in the ecosystem? Is there a ton of water in the ecosystem, or anything in between? And we're going to look at how these combinations of biotic and abiotic components interact and how energy flows and materials cycle through these ecosystems. So an example of an ecosystem is a pond. So here's a pond. Another example would be a swamp. With the swamp, you have to have more coverage from the trees. And then here's a meadow with outstanding water, but there's not enough water here to have trees like you would have here. So these are 4 different ecosystems. They have different organisms that can live in them, and they have different abiotic factors too, like the temperature, the water level, even the minerals present might be different. Now we're going to look at the energy source and energy flow through an ecosystem. Energy in an ecosystem originally comes from, I bet you know, the sun. Yay, sun! So there are a few ecosystems on the planet that don't have the sun as their energy source. So the thermal vents in the bottom of the ocean, for example, would be one. Um, there are some bacteria that can use like sulfate to make their energy. But anyway, for us, 99.999% of what we're looking at is ecosystems that get their energy from the sun. So that's what we're going to spend our time on. Energy flows through the ecosystem in one direction, starts with producers like plants, and then somebody eats the plants, and those are the consumers. Eventually, the energy dissipates. Producers are something you have to memorize. Producers are the ones that make food. So if you think of a product that a company makes, that's the thing that they're making. So remember that producers make food. You might go into your kitchen and make dinner, but that's different than actually making your food from things like carbon dioxide. So it's a really important distinction there. You can put a star next to that so you can remember it. Consumer, you should know also, these use food by eating something else. And so this, I'm using the term very loosely here. A consumer is something that gets its energy from something besides the sun, or let me say it this way. A consumer takes in nutrients from, okay. A consumer takes in nutrients from either another consumer or from a producer. So that would be like us. So there are different types of consumers. So for example, you can eat another organism by ingesting it in your mouth, or you can be more like a fungus or certain bacteria that will just absorb their nutrients from decaying organisms. So the first thing that we're going to look at are food chains and levels of organisms within a food chain. After this, we're going to get into something that's more realistic and a lot more complicated called food webs. And so a food web is going to be made of a whole bunch of food chains. So here's a food chain. You start with a producer. And a producer is something, again, that uses the sun. It does photosynthesis, and it um, makes its own food. The caterpillar is the first consumer. And so this would be a primary consumer, and it eats the plant. We'd also call that an herbivore. The frog would be a secondary consumer, and we could also call that a carnivore because it eats a caterpillar. The snake eats the frog, so that would be a tertiary consumer, third level consumer. And then here's the owl eating the snake, and that would be a quaternary consumer. Of course, the owl can eat a frog too, so that's when we're getting into food webs, which is a little more complicated, and we'll do that in a few minutes. Producers use most of the energy that they make for themselves, so they need it to make the nectar that they are producing. They need it for the smell, which really doesn't have a purpose except for trying to get the bees to come. And so some of that energy is not able to go on to the next level. Let's look at some more producers. Here's a tree. And parts of the tree, the leaves, are going to be eaten by the giraffe. So the giraffe would be an herbivore or a primary consumer. Most of the energy that's in the plant level just stays there. So the energy that is not used by the producers can then be passed on to the organisms that can't make their own energy. And I don't know why this is flying fast today. So about 90% of the energy is either here or it's lost as heat, and it doesn't go on to the next level. But this level gets about 10% of the energy that was captured here. Consumers that eat producers to get energy. So for example, the dinosaur, I think that's what it is, eating the plant. They're the first order or primary consumers. They're also called herbivores or plant eaters. The primary consumers use most of the energy that they get from the producer for themselves. This, um, this bird is, I think, being chased by something and trying to get away. So that bird's using most of the energy that it needs to make its beak really hard or to make its feathers just the right way. But a lot of that energy is actually lost as heat. So a good percentage of it moves into the atmosphere as heat. And once that happens, it's really not used again. But some of that energy is stored in the consumer, and it's not lost to the atmosphere or used by the consumer itself. So that's the energy that's available for another consumer, which would be the predator. So here's a predator. A consumer that eats another consumer for energy is called a secondary or a second order consumer, and it can be a carnivore or an omnivore. A carnivore is one that eats animals, an omnivore would eat both animals and plants. And the carnivores can be predators. That means they're eating, well, either one, I guess. A predator would be one that hunts down and kills an organism to eat, and a scavenger will eat an organism that it was killed by somebody else or died for its own other reasons. The secondary consumers use most of the energy that they get from the primary consumers for themselves, but some of the energy is lost as heat, and some energy is stored and can be passed on to the next one. So a consumer that eats a consumer that ate another consumer, let's see, is called a third order consumer or tertiary consumer. I'll always show you a chart of it so you can count them out. And they can be either a carnivore or an omnivore. So for example, a bear will eat berries, for example. Whoa. So a bear would eat berries, so it would also eat, any animal that it can get its hands on, so that's why it would be considered an omnivore, for example. And again, predators or scavengers. And that's, I think, all we have time for today. Bye!